There are few deaths in history as meticulously designed to break not just a body, but a nation's spirit. What happened to William Wallace on that sweltering August morning in 1305 wasn't merely an execution. It was a choreographed descent into hell, a calculated dismantling of flesh and bone that would make medieval London streets run red with more than just blood. By the time the executioner's blade finally ended Wallace's agony, his screams had echoed through the cobblestone alleys of Smithfield for hours, reverberating as a warning that would haunt Scotland for generations. The man who would die so horrifically began life as little more than a minor noble's son in the rolling hills of Renfrewshire. Born around 1270 in Elderslie, William Wallace entered a world where Scotland knew peace under the steady hand of King Alexander III. His father, likely Sir Malcolm Wallace, held lands that marked the family as lesser nobility, vassals to James Stuart, the fifth High Steward of Scotland. Wallace's childhood unfolded in an era of prosperity and stability that few Scots of his generation would live to see again. The young William received an education befitting his station, learning Latin and French from his uncles who served as clergymen. He mastered the arts of reading and writing, skills that would later allow him to conduct diplomatic correspondence with European powers. But it was his training in warfare that would define his destiny. Like other boys of noble blood, Wallace learned to wield sword and spear, to ride a destrier into battle, and to command men in the deadly dance of medieval combat. His seal, bearing the archer's insignia, suggests he may have served as a mercenary archer, perhaps even in Edward I's own campaigns in Wales, before Scotland's troubles began. But the Scotland of Wallace's youth was living on borrowed time. The peace that had defined his childhood shattered like glass against stone on a cold March night in 1286. King Alexander III, returning from his wedding feast at Kinghorn, urged his horse through a violent storm, despite his counselor's warnings. The next morning, searchers found the king's broken body on the rocky shore, below a coastal cliff. With Alexander's death, the golden age of Scottish independence began its inexorable slide toward catastrophe. The crown passed to Alexander's granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, a child of barely 3 years. Regents assumed control of the kingdom, while the young queen remained in Norway with her father. For 4 years, Scotland balanced precariously on the edge of civil war as rival noble factions maneuvered for position. Then, in September 1290, came the news that would seal Scotland's fate. Margaret had fallen ill during her voyage to claim her throne and died in the Orkney Islands, leaving Scotland without a direct heir for the first time in centuries. 13 claimants emerged to contest the vacant throne, but 2 stood above the rest. John Balliol descended from the eldest daughter of an earlier king, while Robert Bruce, grandfather of the future Robert the Bruce, claimed through a younger but more direct male line. Rather than allow civil war to tear their kingdom apart, the Scottish nobles made a decision that would haunt their nation for generations. They invited Edward I of England, known as Longshanks for his towering frame and Hammer of the Scots for his brutal ambitions, to arbitrate their succession dispute. Edward accepted with alacrity, but demanded a price that should have warned the Scots of his true intentions. Before he would render judgment, every claimant must acknowledge him as Lord Paramount of Scotland, accepting that the Scottish throne was held as a feudal vassal to the English crown. It was a clever trap, and one from which Scotland would find no easy escape. In November 1292, at Berwick-upon-Tweed, Edward rendered his verdict. John Balliol would be king, but only as Edward's puppet. The reign of John Balliol proved to be a masterclass in humiliation. Edward summoned the Scottish king to English courts like a common plaintiff. demanded Scottish troops for his wars in France, and systematically stripped away every vestige of Scottish independence. The Scottish nobles, watching their sovereignty dissolve before their eyes, grew increasingly restless. By 1295, a Council of 12 had effectively removed power from Balliol's hands and concluded a mutual defence treaty with France, the alliance that would become known as the Old Alliance. Edward's response was swift and merciless. In March 1296, he crossed the border with the largest army Scotland had ever faced. The assault on Berwick-upon-Tweed set the tone for what was to come. Edward's soldiers showed no mercy to the prosperous border town, slaughtering merchants, craftsmen, and children with equal enthusiasm. Contemporary accounts suggest that thousands died in what amounted to a medieval war crime, their bodies left to rot in the streets as a warning to any who might resist English authority. The Scottish army, hastily assembled and poorly coordinated, met Edward's forces at Dunbar on April 27, 1296. The battle was a catastrophe. In less than a day, Scotland's military power lay shattered across a blood-soaked field. Among the prisoners taken was John Balliol himself, soon to be stripped of his royal regalia in a ceremony designed to humiliate not just a king, but an entire people. The Scots would remember him forever after as Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat, a broken man whose weakness had delivered his kingdom into bondage. By summer's end, Edward had received the formal submission of nearly 2,000 Scottish nobles in what became known as the Ragman Roll, a document that recorded Scotland's capitulation in meticulous detail. Those who signed saved their lands and lives by acknowledging Edward as their rightful sovereign. Those who refused faced exile, imprisonment, or death. Among the latter were the Wallace family, whose absence from the roll marked them as enemies of the new order from the very beginning. Edward believed he had solved the Scottish problem once and for all. He removed the Stone of Destiny, the ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, from Scone Abbey and transported it to Westminster, where it would remain for 7 centuries. Scottish laws were replaced with English ones. Scottish officials were dismissed in favour of English administrators, and the very name of Scotland seemed destined to fade into history like so many other conquered kingdoms. But Edward had underestimated the fire that burned in Scottish hearts. Scattered resistance began almost immediately after his supposed victory. In the Highlands and Lowlands, in isolated castles and remote glens, men who had lost everything began to gather weapons and followers. Among them was a young man whose father's lands had been seized and whose family name appeared nowhere on the Ragman Roll. William Wallace, barely 26 years old, was about to emerge from obscurity to challenge the mightiest king in Christendom. The spark that ignited Wallace's rebellion came in the spring of 1297, though the exact circumstances remain shrouded in legend and conflicting accounts. Some sources claim he was provoked by the murder of his wife, Marion Braidfoot, at English hands. Others suggest a more personal slight, an insult delivered by English soldiers that no man of honour could ignore. What seems certain is that in May 1297, Wallace gathered 30 trusted men and struck at the heart of English power in his region. The target was Lanark, a prosperous town that served as a symbol of English authority in the Scottish lowlands. More specifically, Wallace sought William de Heselrigg, the English sheriff who had become a hated symbol of oppression through his brutal taxation and arbitrary justice. The attack came without warning, in the grey dawn of a May morning. Wallace and his followers swept through Lanark's streets like a force of nature, setting fire to English buildings and cutting down any who stood in their way. When they found Heselrigg, cowering in his fortified manor, Wallace's vengeance was both swift and personal. The sheriff died by Wallace's own hand, though whether by sword or dirk, the chronicles do not agree. What mattered was the symbolism. For the first time since Dunbar, an English official of rank had paid with his life for the occupation of Scotland. Word of the sheriff's death spread across the lowlands like wildfire, carrying with it a message that resistance was not only possible, but could be successful. The burning of Lanark marked Wallace's transformation from minor noble to national leader. Men flocked to his banner from across southern Scotland, drawn by his charisma and the promise of striking back at their oppressors. Unlike the great lords who had signed their names to Edward's roll, Wallace offered uncompromising resistance. He would neither negotiate with the English nor accept their authority in any form. Scotland would be free, or Wallace would die in the attempt. From Lanark, Wallace's growing army moved north to Scone, the ancient seat of Scottish kings. There they drove out the English justiciar and attacked the scattered English garrisons that dotted the landscape between the Forth and Tay. Each victory brought more followers, as word spread that a leader had finally emerged who could match English steel with Scottish courage. By midsummer, Wallace commanded a force of several thousand men, mostly commoners and lesser nobles who had nothing left to lose under English rule. But Wallace was not the only flame of resistance burning in Scotland that year. In the northeast, another rebellion had erupted under the leadership of Andrew Moray, son of a powerful lord who had died in Edward's dungeons. Moray had escaped from Chester Castle during the winter of 1296 to 97 and returned to his father's lands to raise the standard of revolt. Like Wallace, he refused all English offers of clemency and fought with a ferocity that soon cleared the English from much of northern Scotland. The two rebel leaders, operating in different regions and commanding separate armies, represented different aspects of Scottish resistance. Wallace drew his strength from the common people and minor nobility who had been dispossessed by English rule. Moray commanded the loyalty of powerful Highland clans and lowland lords who retained their ancient feudal obligations. When they finally joined forces in the late summer of 1297, they created a military alliance that would shake the foundations of Edward's Scottish conquest. The English response to these twin rebellions was predictably harsh. Edward I dispatched John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, northward, with a powerful army of professional soldiers, heavy cavalry, and veteran archers. Surrey was a seasoned commander who had served Edward faithfully in Wales and France. His orders were explicit: crush the Scottish rebellion with such thoroughness that no one would dare challenge English authority again. Surrey's confidence was understandable. His army outnumbered the combined Scottish forces by perhaps 2 to 1, with 3,000 heavy cavalry and 8 to 10,000 infantry. More importantly, his soldiers were professionals, trained in the newest tactics and equipped with the finest armor and weapons that English wealth could provide. Against them stood a rabble of Scottish peasants and dispossessed nobles, armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge and bound together by little more than shared hatred for their oppressors. But Surrey and his English colleagues had made a crucial miscalculation. They had dismissed their enemies as mere bandits and outlaws, unworthy of serious tactical consideration. They failed to recognize that Wallace and Moray had combined the desperate courage of men fighting for their homeland with shrewd military intelligence and careful planning. The Scots had chosen their battlefield with meticulous care, and when the two armies finally met at Stirling Bridge, the English would discover that superior numbers and equipment could not overcome superior tactics and absolute determination. The summer of 1297 was drawing to a close as the two armies converged on Stirling, the ancient fortress town that commanded the crucial crossing point between the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands. Whoever controlled Stirling controlled the gateway to the north, and both sides understood that the coming battle would determine whether Scotland's rebellion would spread or be crushed in its infancy. Wallace and Moray had positioned their forces on the high ground north of the River Forth, while Surrey's English army approached from the south, confident in their numerical superiority and eager to finish this Scottish nonsense once and for all. Neither side could have imagined that the battle to come would transform an obscure knight and a northern lord into legends whose names would echo through the centuries. Nor could they have foreseen that the narrow bridge spanning the dark waters of the Forth would become the stage for one of the most stunning military upsets in medieval history. The events of September 11th, 1297, would announce to the world that Scotland was far from conquered, and that William Wallace had emerged as a leader capable of challenging the greatest military power of the age. But even as he prepared for the battle that would make his reputation, Wallace could not have known that his ultimate fate was already being written in the margins of history. For every victory against Edward Longshanks would be remembered, every humiliation catalogued, every act of defiance added to a ledger that would one day demand the most terrible payment imaginable. The man who was about to become Scotland's greatest hero was also, unknowingly, volunteering for one of history's most excruciating deaths. The morning of September 11th, 1297, dawned cold and misty over the River Forth, but the air itself seemed to vibrate with the anticipation of violence. Wallace and Moray had chosen their position with the calculated precision of chess masters, positioning their forces on the slopes of Abbey Craig, while the massive English army assembled on the opposite bank. What followed would be remembered as one of the most brilliant tactical victories in medieval warfare, a David and Goliath moment that would echo through history as the ultimate vindication of Scottish courage against impossible odds. The narrow wooden bridge that spanned the Forth was barely wide enough for two horsemen to ride abreast, a bottleneck that would prove fatal to English ambitions. Surrey, confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, had dismissed offers from local lords to guide his forces to nearby fords, where his army could cross safely in greater numbers. Such caution, he believed, was unnecessary when facing what he considered a rabble of peasants and outlaws. The Earl's arrogance would cost him dearly. Wallace and Moray waited with the patience of hunters as the English vanguard began to file across the bridge in the early morning hours. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that the Scottish leaders observed the crossing from their elevated position, allowing roughly half the English force to cross before giving the signal to attack. According to the Chronicle of Hemingber, they waited until as many of the enemy had come over as they believed they could overcome. When the attack came, it was devastating in its precision and ferocity. The Scots spearmen came down from the high ground in rapid advance, their schiltrons bristling with 12-foot spears like enormous hedgehogs, and fended off the charge by English heavy cavalry before counter-attacking the infantry. The English soldiers who had crossed found themselves trapped on three sides by the meandering loop of the River Forth, with the Scottish advance blocking their only escape route north. The English soldiers soon floundered in the marshy ground, and many thousands were killed either by Scottish spears or burdened by armor and chainmail, by drowning. The narrow bridge became a scene of horror as retreating English soldiers collided with reinforcements still trying to cross, creating a chaotic tangle of men and horses. At about this time, the center of the wooden bridge collapsed, throwing English troops into the river and cutting off movement in both directions. Among the prominent casualties was Sir Hugh Cressingham, Edward's hated treasurer in Scotland, who was killed early in the fight when he fell from his horse. The man who had demanded the cheapest possible military strategy, regardless of its consequences, became one of its first victims. Hugh de Cressingham was supposedly skinned and cut to pieces by the Scots, with some accounts claiming that Wallace had a sword belt made from the treasurer's hide. though this may be legend embellishing an already dramatic victory. Contemporary English chronicler Walter of Gisborough recorded the English losses as 100 cavalry and 5,000 infantry killed. Scottish casualties were remarkably light, with one tragic exception that would prove catastrophic for the future of Scottish resistance. Andrew Moray was mortally wounded during the battle and died by November. Scotland had lost not just a brilliant military commander, but a man who possessed the strategic genius and noble connections that Wallace lacked. The immediate aftermath of Stirling Bridge saw Wallace's transformation from rebel leader to international figure. He was knighted and became Guardian of Scotland, beginning to issue correspondence to other countries, declaring Scotland's independent status and seeking friendship and trade. One of these letters survives, the Lubeck letter, written in the names of both Andrew de Moray and William Wallace, suggesting that Moray may still have been alive in October 1297. But Wallace's greatest triumph contained the seeds of his eventual downfall. Without Moray's military expertise and political connections, Wallace found himself isolated among the Scottish nobility, many of whom resented his humble origins and meteoric rise to power. His successful raid into Northumberland during the winter of 1297 to 98 brought wealth to Scotland, but also demonstrated to Edward I that the Scottish problem required his personal attention. Edward's response was swift and overwhelming. In the spring of 1298, he assembled a new and larger army and moved into Scotland that summer. His forces included some 2,500 mounted knights and about 12,500 infantry, among them many veteran English and Welsh archers armed with longbows. This was no hastily assembled punitive expedition, but a carefully planned campaign designed to crush Scottish resistance once and for all. Wallace prudently avoided a direct engagement, retreating before Edward's force and employing a scorched earth policy that denied food and supplies to the English. This strategy was nearly successful, as shortages of provisions drove Edward's army to the brink of mutiny. The English quartermaster's failure to prepare for the expedition left morale and food supplies low, and a resulting riot within Edward's own army had to be put down by cavalry. But fate and treachery intervened to force Wallace into the pitched battle he had been trying to avoid. Wallace planned a night attack on Edward's army near Kirkliston, just northwest of Edinburgh, but was betrayed by two Scottish nobles who resented Wallace's rise to power. With his position compromised, and Edward's forces bearing down on him, Wallace had little choice but to make a stand at Falkirk. The Battle of Falkirk on July 22nd, 1298, would prove to be Wallace's military masterpiece and his ultimate undoing. Wallace chose his position in front of wet marshland on high ground and deployed much of his infantry in 4 schiltrons, each holding spears up to 4 meters long. This formation had proven devastatingly effective against cavalry at Stirling Bridge, and Wallace believed it could work again against Edward's knights. Wallace allegedly proclaimed after forming his units, "I have brought you to the ring. It is up to you to dance now." But this time, Wallace faced an opponent who had learned from previous defeats and adapted his tactics accordingly. Edward was reluctant to allow a conventional cavalry charge over the dangerous terrain, instead sending parties to try circumventing the schiltrons. When the initial English cavalry charges met with predictable disaster, Edward wisely called back his mounted knights and brought up massed units of Welsh archers. They fired shower upon shower of longbow arrows on Wallace's tightly packed schiltron units. The same formations that had been impregnable to cavalry charges became death traps under the withering arrow storm. At the crucial moment, treachery struck again. Some 10,000 of the Scots, mostly mounted warriors led by Red John Comyn, an enemy of Robert the Bruce, quit the field and led his contingent off the battlefield. Wallace had been betrayed by his own countrymen at the moment when unity was most essential. The combination of Welsh arrows and Scottish treachery proved too much for even Wallace's iron discipline to overcome. Casualties among the Scottish leaders included Wallace's second-in-command, Sir John de Graham, as well as Sir John Stewart and Macduff of Fife. The flower of Scottish resistance lay dead on the field at Falkirk, while Wallace managed to escape into the forests with the surviving remnants of his army. His military reputation, built on the miracle of Stirling Bridge, lay in ruins. Shortly after the battle, Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland in September 1298 and was succeeded by Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of all Scotland found himself reduced to little more than a guerrilla leader, operating from the shadows, while others took control of the resistance movement he had created. But Wallace refused to accept defeat, even as his political influence waned. In 1299, he left Scotland for the court of King Philip IV of France on a diplomatic mission to secure foreign support for Scottish independence. Philip IV supported him financially and provided him with a letter of recommendation in November 1300 for his agents at the papal court in Rome. This was no pleasure trip, but a desperate attempt to build the international coalition that Scotland would need to survive Edward's relentless pressure. Wallace was definitely in France in 1300 and intended to go on a diplomatic mission to Rome to put Scotland's case to Pope Boniface VIII. The evidence suggests he was working to secure the release of John Balliol, who remained in papal custody in France, possibly hoping to restore him as Scotland's legitimate king. It was a complex diplomatic game that required Wallace to operate far from his natural element as a battlefield commander. Briefly imprisoned for suspect political motives, he was soon released and given the French king's safe escort to the papal court. He returned to Scotland in 1301, with the diplomatic effort seemingly in positive condition. But Wallace's hopes for French intervention were soon dashed when France needed the help of Edward to suppress a revolt in Flanders and withdrew her support of Scotland. From the autumn of 1299, nothing is known of Wallace's activities for more than 4 years. These were the lost years, when the former Guardian of Scotland operated in the shadows as a hunted fugitive. By 1304, Scottish leaders, seeing no prospect of victory, recognized Edward as overlord. One by one, the great nobles who had once followed Wallace made their peace with English rule, leaving him increasingly isolated. Wallace still represented the mass of the people, and Edward was determined to capture at all costs the man who was in himself the embodiment of that popular hostility. The English king understood that as long as Wallace remained free, he would serve as a living symbol of Scottish resistance, inspiring others to take up arms against English rule. The hunt for Wallace became a personal obsession for Edward, who offered substantial rewards for information leading to his capture. By 1304, Wallace was back in Scotland and involved in scattered guerrilla attacks, but his options were steadily diminishing. Wallace evaded capture by the English until 5 August 1305, when John de Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to Edward, turned Wallace over to English soldiers at Robroyston, near Glasgow. The man who had once commanded armies was reduced to sleeping in safe houses, dependent on the loyalty of followers who were themselves under increasing pressure to betray him. King Edward I had put a price on Wallace's head and ordered the Scottish nobles to deliver him, but the hammer of the Scots soon lost patience with their tardiness. No one wanted to bring in Scotland's hero. The very reluctance of the Scottish nobility to betray Wallace demonstrated that despite his political isolation, he remained a beloved figure among ordinary Scots, who saw him as the embodiment of their national aspirations. The circumstances of Wallace's capture remain shrouded in accounts of treachery and betrayal. Someone must have informed on where he could be found that night in Robroyston, possibly a man named Rab Ray, but the facts of the drama are uncertain and lost to us. What seems clear is that Wallace was staying in a house with his faithful companion Curly, expecting what he believed to be a safe rendezvous, when English soldiers surrounded the building in the darkness. Wallace was captured about midnight on the 5th of August 1305, when alone with his faithful friend and co-patriot Curly, who was slain. The companion who died defending Wallace represented the loyalty that the former guardian still inspired among those who knew him personally, even as the great nobles abandoned the cause for which he had sacrificed everything. Letters of safe conduct from Haakon V of Norway, Philip IV of France, and John Balliol, along with other documents, were found in Wallace's possession and delivered to Edward. These documents revealed the extent of Wallace's diplomatic efforts and confirmed Edward's suspicions that the Scottish resistance had been seeking foreign intervention. The discovery of such correspondence only strengthened Edward's determination to make Wallace's execution a spectacular warning to any who might consider following his example. Wallace was initially held at the imposing fortress of Dumbarton on the Clyde under Sir John Menteith, before being taken south to Carlisle. The journey to London took nearly 3 weeks, during which Wallace was paraded through English towns as a trophy of Edward's victory. Crowds gathered to see the man who had terrorized English armies, many expecting to find a giant, but discovering instead a tall but unremarkable-looking knight who bore his captivity with stoic dignity. Wallace wasn't executed right away and was forced to travel the near 400 miles to London for a trial. This was never intended to be a fair trial. The outcome was already decided. Edward wanted Wallace's execution to serve as both entertainment and education for the English people, demonstrating the inevitable fate of those who dared challenge English authority. The long journey south was itself part of the psychological warfare, giving Edward time to prepare the elaborate spectacle of justice that would culminate in Smithfield. In London, Wallace was bound hand and foot and paraded before the crowd. For years, Wallace had terrorized the English, and now their fear knew only righteous outrage. The man who had once inspired terror in English hearts was now reduced to a chained prisoner, his fall from grace serving as a powerful symbol of English superiority. Yet even in captivity, Wallace maintained the bearing of a soldier, refusing to grovel or beg for mercy that he knew would never come. As the summer of 1305 drew to a close, Wallace found himself confined in the Tower of London, awaiting the trial that would be the final act of his remarkable life. Outside the fortress walls, London buzzed with anticipation for the spectacle to come. Citizens who had lived in fear of Scottish raids now looked forward to witnessing the destruction of the man who had humiliated English armies and challenged the divine right of their king. But Wallace's captors had prepared something far more elaborate than a simple execution. What awaited him at Westminster Hall would be a carefully choreographed performance designed to justify not just his death, but the complete subjugation of Scotland. The man who had risen from obscurity to become guardian of Scotland was about to discover that his final battle would be fought not with sword and spear, but with words and legal precedents, in a courtroom where the verdict had been decided long before he ever set foot in the dock. The stage was set for the final act of William Wallace's extraordinary life, a grotesque theatre of justice that would transform a Scottish knight into an eternal symbol of resistance. But first, Edward's lawyers and propagandists would need to destroy Wallace's reputation as thoroughly as they planned to destroy his body, ensuring that his death would serve as both punishment and warning for generations to come. On the morning of August 23rd, 1305, Westminster Hall witnessed one of the most elaborate charades in the annals of English justice. The massive Norman Hall, with its soaring hammer-beam roof and stone walls that had witnessed the pageantry of royal ceremonies, was transformed into a theatre of vengeance, where the outcome had been scripted long before the first word was spoken. Wallace stood in chains before his accusers, knowing full well that this was no trial, but an execution masquerading as jurisprudence. The proceedings began with a deliberate humiliation, designed to strip Wallace of any remaining dignity. He was crowned with a garland of oak leaves, a mocking reference to his supposed status as King of the Outlaws. The irony was not lost on those present. The man who had once been hailed as Guardian of Scotland was now presented as nothing more than a common brigand. Yet even in chains, Wallace maintained the bearing of a knight, his defiance radiating from every fibre of his being. The charges read against Wallace were as comprehensive as they were calculated. He was accused of high treason against King Edward I, despite the glaring legal problem that Wallace had never sworn allegiance to the English crown. He was charged with committing atrocities against civilians in war, accused of sparing neither age nor sex, monk nor nun during his campaigns. The indictment painted him as a monster who had brought war to peaceful English settlements and shown no mercy to the innocent. But perhaps most tellingly, Wallace was charged with sacrilege, burning churches, destroying religious vessels and shrines, and defiling sacred spaces. These charges revealed the deeper purpose of the trial, not merely to justify Wallace's execution, but to destroy his reputation as a righteous defender of Scotland. Edward's lawyers understood that martyrs were made of religious warriors. They intended to transform Wallace into a common criminal, whose death would inspire revulsion rather than rebellion. When given the opportunity to respond to the treason charge, Wallace delivered what would become his most famous declaration: "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. He is not my sovereign, he never received my homage, and whilst life is in this persecuted body, he never shall receive it." These words, spoken with unwavering conviction, cut to the heart of the legal fiction underlying English claims to Scotland. Wallace's defence was both legally sound and politically devastating. He was a Scottish knight who had fought for his rightful king, John Balliol, against a foreign invader. The English court, however, was not interested in legal niceties. The judges had been instructed that Wallace was an outlaw, declared beyond the protection of law itself. Being outlawed meant that anyone could kill him without trial, making even this mock proceeding an act of royal mercy. The verdict was predetermined, the sentence already written, and the execution schedule already arranged. Wallace was condemned to suffer the penalty reserved for the most heinous traitors, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The sentence was pronounced with the clinical precision of a medical procedure. Wallace was to be taken from Westminster Hall to the Tower of London, then stripped naked and dragged through the city at the heels of a horse to the elms at Smithfield. There he would be hanged by the neck until nearly dead, then cut down while still alive. His genitals would be removed and burned before his eyes, his belly opened, and his entrails drawn out and consigned to the flames. His heart would be cut from his chest, and only then would he be granted the mercy of beheading. Finally, his body would be quartered, the pieces displayed in various cities throughout England and Scotland as a warning to any who might follow his example. Each element of this grotesque ritual served a specific purpose in medieval thinking about crime and punishment. The drawing through the streets was designed to humiliate and display the prisoner to the populace. The hanging represented punishment for common crimes like robbery and murder. The disembowelment was believed to purge the treasonous thoughts that originated in the bowels, while the burning of the entrails symbolically cleansed the kingdom of corruption. The beheading marked the severing of the treasonous mind from the body politic, and the quartering demonstrated the complete dismemberment of rebellion itself. As the court proceedings concluded, Wallace maintained his stoic demeanor, showing neither fear nor repentance. Those present noted that he neither begged for mercy nor attempted to negotiate his fate. The man who had never surrendered to Edward I in life would not submit to him in death. Wallace was immediately conveyed from Westminster Hall to the Tower of London, where he spent his final hours in the cold stone chambers that had held so many condemned prisoners before him. The journey from Westminster to Smithfield on the morning of August 23rd was itself a crucial component of Wallace's punishment. He was stripped naked and tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to maximize humiliation while preventing the quick death that might result from being dragged directly behind horses. The route took him through the heart of medieval London, past shops and houses where citizens gathered to witness the destruction of Scotland's most famous rebel. The crowds that lined the streets were encouraged to participate actively in Wallace's degradation. Contemporary accounts describe how bystanders pelted him with garbage and excrement, beat him with sticks and whips, and shouted abuse as he was dragged over the rough cobblestones. This was popular justice in its rawest form, allowing ordinary English citizens to take personal revenge on the man who had terrorized their armies and threatened their sense of security. Yet even as his body was battered and bloodied by the 6-mile journey, Wallace endured without crying out or begging for mercy. The destination was Smithfield, specifically a location known as the Elms, where a cluster of elm trees provided natural gallows for the capital's most significant executions. By the time Wallace arrived, a substantial crowd had gathered, drawn by the promise of witnessing the destruction of England's most notorious enemy. The scaffold that awaited him was deliberately low, forcing Wallace to mount only a few steps and keeping him close to the jeering spectators who had come to see justice done. The execution began with the hanging, but this was not intended to kill. The rope was carefully calibrated to strangle Wallace to the point of unconsciousness without ending his life. As he dangled, gasping and choking, the crowd cheered and jeered at the man who had once commanded their terror. When he was cut down, still breathing but barely conscious, the true horror began. The castration that followed was both literal and symbolic punishment. In medieval thinking, Wallace's relationship with his followers was seen as unnatural, a perversion of proper feudal bonds that bound men to their rightful English overlords. The removal of his genitals served to unmake him as a man while symbolically severing the generative power that had created the Scottish rebellion. The executioner held up the severed organs to the crowd before casting them into a fire prepared for this purpose, the smoke carrying away what remained of Wallace's masculine authority. The disembowelment was conducted with surgical precision, designed to prolong suffering while ensuring Wallace remained conscious for as long as possible. Medieval executioners were skilled in keeping victims alive through the removal of internal organs, understanding which could be extracted without immediately causing death. Wallace's belly was opened, and his entrails slowly drawn out while he watched, still breathing, still aware of every cut. His intestines were fed into the flames, the acrid smoke of burning flesh rising over Smithfield as the crowd roared its approval. The removal of Wallace's heart was the climactic moment of the execution, both practically and symbolically. The executioner reached into Wallace's chest cavity and extracted the still beating organ, holding it aloft as he shouted the traditional phrase, "Behold the heart of a traitor." This moment represented the complete victory of English justice over Scottish rebellion, the literal removal of the source of treasonous thought and feeling. Only then was Wallace granted the release of death through beheading. The sword that severed his head finally ended an ordeal that had lasted hours, transforming the once proud guardian of Scotland into a collection of dismembered parts. But even in death, Wallace's body would find no peace. The quartering that followed was conducted with methodical brutality, his limbs severed and prepared for transport to the far corners of Britain. Wallace's head was immediately dipped in tar to preserve it, and mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, where it would remain visible to all who entered or left the capital city. The grisly trophy joined other traitors' heads in what had become a ghoulish gallery of royal justice, a warning to any who might consider challenging English authority. His preserved head was later joined by the heads of his brother John and his compatriots Simon Fraser and John of Strathbogie, creating a collection of Scottish defiance frozen in death. The 4 quarters of Wallace's body were dispatched to different cities throughout England and Scotland, each serving as a monument to English victory and a warning against future rebellion. 1 quarter was sent to Newcastle, another to Berwick upon Tweed, a third to Stirling, and the 4th to Perth. The choice of locations was deliberate. Newcastle and Berwick were English border strongholds that had borne the brunt of Scottish raids, while Stirling and Perth were Scottish cities that had witnessed Wallace's greatest triumphs. The display of Wallace's remains in Stirling was particularly cruel, as this was the site of his greatest victory over English arms. The quarter of his body that hung from the gibbet there served as a grotesque counterpoint to the monument that would one day rise on Abbey Craig to honour his memory. Edward I intended this desecration to poison forever the well of Scottish inspiration that Wallace had created, transforming sites of triumph into reminders of the cost of defying English rule. Yet Edward's elaborate choreography of humiliation and terror ultimately backfired. Rather than crushing Scottish resistance, Wallace's martyrdom became the foundation stone of a more determined independence movement. The very brutality of his execution transformed him from a political leader into a religious figure, a Christ-like sacrifice whose suffering redeemed the sins of Scottish collaboration with English rule. Within months of Wallace's death, new leaders emerged to take up the struggle he had embodied. Robert the Bruce, who had once served alongside Wallace and later competed with him for leadership of the resistance, found in Wallace's martyrdom the inspiration needed to claim the Scottish throne. On March 25, 1306, Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone, beginning the campaign that would culminate in Scotland's definitive victory at Bannockburn in 1314. The immediate impact of Wallace's execution reverberated throughout medieval Europe. Foreign courts that had witnessed Edward's campaigns in Wales and Scotland understood the message. This was the fate awaiting any who dared challenge English expansion. Yet they also recognized something else in Wallace's defiant death, the power of martyrdom to inspire resistance rather than submission. Kings and princes across Christendom noted how brutality, when taken too far, could create the very opposition it sought to destroy. In Scotland itself, Wallace's execution had consequences that Edward never anticipated. Rather than terrorizing the population into permanent submission, the horror of his death crystallized Scottish opposition around the simple principle that no people should endure such treatment at the hands of foreign oppressors. The scattered resistance that had characterized the years after Falkirk began to coalesce into a national movement, with Wallace's memory as its spiritual center. The legal precedents established by Wallace's trial would echo through centuries of English jurisprudence. His case became one of the earliest examples of what modern scholars recognize as a prosecution for war crimes, establishing principles about the conduct of warfare that would influence international law into the modern era. The charges of targeting civilians and destroying religious sites created templates for prosecuting military commanders that persist today. More immediately, Wallace's trial demonstrated the English Crown's determination to treat Scottish resistance not as legitimate warfare between sovereign nations, but as criminal rebellion against lawful authority. This legal fiction would justify centuries of brutal suppression, but it would also provide Scottish patriots with a powerful counter-narrative. They were not rebels, but defenders of an ancient kingdom against foreign invasion. The sites associated with Wallace's final day became pilgrimage destinations for later generations of Scottish patriots. Westminster Hall, where he faced his accusers, Smithfield, where he died, and London Bridge, where his head was displayed, all became stops on an informal circuit of Scottish remembrance. Visitors would stand where Wallace had stood, imagining the courage required to face such a death without flinching. Edward I died just 2 years after Wallace's execution, his ambitions for a unified British kingdom unfulfilled. His son, Edward II, proved incapable of completing his father's conquest, and Scottish independence was formally recognised by the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. Wallace had not lived to see Scotland's freedom, but his sacrifice had made it possible. The manner of Wallace's death ensured that his story would transcend the political circumstances that created it. The image of the lone warrior facing impossible odds, maintaining his integrity even unto the most horrible death imaginable, spoke to something universal in the human experience. Wallace became more than a Scottish hero. He became a symbol of resistance to tyranny that would inspire oppressed peoples across the world. In the centuries that followed, Wallace's execution would be remembered not for the terror it was meant to inspire, but for the courage it revealed. His refusal to beg for mercy, his steady denial of Edward's authority, and his willingness to endure the most excruciating death rather than betray his principles, transformed him into something approaching a secular saint. The man who had died so horribly became, in death, more powerful than he had ever been in life. The location where Wallace breathed his last at Smithfield is marked today by a small plaque, a modest memorial to a death that shook the foundations of medieval Europe. Visitors still come to stand where Scotland's greatest hero faced his end, drawn by the knowledge that here a man chose principle over life, freedom over submission, and immortal memory over immediate survival. The brutal end of William Wallace was intended to close a chapter in the story of Scottish resistance. Instead, it opened the book that would be written in the blood and courage of those who came after him. Edward Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, had succeeded only in forging the hammer that would one day strike the blow that won Scotland's freedom. In trying to destroy Wallace's legacy, he had instead ensured its immortality. The man who was torn apart for defiance had, in his very destruction, proven indestructible. The body that was quartered and scattered across Britain had become more powerful in death than it ever was in life. And the voice that was silenced forever at Smithfield would echo through the centuries, crying not just for Scotland's freedom, but for the freedom of every people who refused to bow before the demands of tyranny. William Wallace died as he had lived, as a free man who recognized no master save his own conscience and his love for Scotland. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered, and the only defeat that Edward I could never inflict.